There is a silent contradiction at the heart of modern spirituality. The more people talk about awakening, the less tolerance they seem to have for their own suffering. The more they repeat that the ego must disappear, the more confused they become when it stubbornly remains. Something here doesn't add up, and it has nothing to do with a lack of spiritual practice. The idea that the self is the problem spread far too quickly. In the name of higher consciousness, many people learn to distrust their own identity, to treat ordinary human emotions as defects, and to see inner conflict as proof of spiritual failure. The promised relief feels close, almost within reach, but it rarely arrives. And when it doesn't, the blame usually falls on the individual trying to awaken, never on the belief itself. Carl Jung recognized this trap long before it became popular. For him, the self was not merely something to be overcome, but something that had to exist for any genuine transformation to take place. Destroying this structure too early does not lead to liberation. It leads to a subtle psychological fragmentation, quiet, difficult to detect, yet deeply exhausting and destabilizing. This video is not an attack on spirituality, nor a defense of the ego as the absolute center of life. It is an invitation to face a tension that very few people are willing to hold. The self we need to build in order not to lose ourselves, and the self many people try to destroy in the search for immediate relief. Because perhaps the problem was never the self itself, but the haste to get rid of it. If this kind of reflection resonates with you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. That helps this conversation reach others who are also searching for depth, not just comfort. Now, let's continue. The West has always had an uneasy relationship with spirituality, surrounded by deadlines, pressure, and constant demands for performance. A quiet inner conflict grows, one most people struggle to name. Within this context, Buddhism and other Eastern traditions begin to appear as an elegant refuge, almost an instant antidote to everyday suffering. The promise sounds simple, direct, and deeply seductive. Calm the mind, reduce the ego, live in a higher state of awareness. Yet very often, this search begins less as an authentic inner calling and more as a silent cry for relief. When identity starts to feel heavy, spirituality becomes a new language for old pain. People who never had space to listen to their own inner world feel immediate comfort when they hear that the problem is not life itself, but their identification with it. Books, videos, and lectures offer quick explanations, almost magical ones, for a discomfort that took years to form. The issue is not the search itself, but the expectation it creates, the belief that it is possible to transcend discomfort without ever having to move through it. That is where the illusion quietly takes root. It is common to see someone change external habits without touching what truly hurts inside. They change their vocabulary, adopt meditation practices, absorb new concepts, yet carefully avoid confronting their own shadow. Everything that brings guilt, anger, fear, or frustration is gently pushed aside, as if spirituality were the same as instant emotional purification. But what is not seen does not disappear. It simply reorganizes itself beneath the surface of the psyche. This creates a sensation of progress, while very little actually changes. Still, this fascination does not arise from nothing. It reflects a genuine hunger for truth, for meaning, for some form of inner integration. In a world that values productivity over presence, the search for silence and introspection can feel almost rebellious. The danger emerges when this search turns into escape, when awakening becomes emotional anesthesia. Instead of illuminating human experience, spirituality begins to cover it with beautiful language and poorly integrated ideas. Simply observing reality makes this paradox visible. People who constantly speak about peace, yet live in a state of tension. People who defend elevated consciousness, yet cannot tolerate frustration. People who preach detachment, yet react rigidly to the slightest criticism. This is not coincidence, it is self-deception disguised as spirituality, and understanding this initial fascination is essential because it prepares the ground for an unavoidable question. If awakening promises the end of suffering, why do so many spiritually committed people continue to suffer? As interest in spirituality grows, something subtle but important begins to happen. Suffering starts to be treated as a mistake. Instead of being understood, it becomes a sign that something went wrong along the path. Many people assume that once consciousness expands, emotional pain should simply disappear. When it does not, a quiet frustration takes hold, that unsettling feeling of, I am doing everything right, and yet something still hurts. At this point, spirituality risks becoming a manual for avoidance. Difficult emotions are quickly labeled as attachment, ego weakness, or lack of spiritual development. Instead of listening to what discomfort is trying to communicate, the person attempts to eliminate it as quickly as possible. But the unconscious does not function that way. What is not listened to finds other paths of expression, often emerging as anxiety, chronic irritation, or a persistent inner tension that is hard to explain. In everyday life, this contradiction is easy to spot. Someone meditates daily, yet explodes during small family disagreements. Another studies Buddhism deeply, yet cannot tolerate criticism at work. The language speaks of peace, but the inner experience tells a different story. The shadow, pushed aside in the name of spirituality, begins to operate behind the scenes, and the more it is ignored, the more power it gains. This does not mean spirituality is wrong for offering ways to relate differently to suffering. The problem appears when spirituality is used as escape rather than understanding. There is a profound difference between holding pain with clarity and attempting to erase it through spiritual decree. When suffering is denied, it creates the illusion of progress, an illusion that eventually demands payment. The pain returns, not as a teacher, but as a symptom. Here lies the most delicate point. Suffering is not necessarily an obstacle to awakening. It can be part of the integration process itself. It carries essential information about repressed desires, unacknowledged fears, and avoided truths. Ignoring it may bring temporary relief, but it strengthens self-deception. And this leads directly to the next essential question. If suffering insists on remaining, is the problem really suffering, or the way the ego is being treated on this path? In many spiritual narratives, the ego is portrayed as the great enemy of human experience. It is blamed for suffering, inner conflict, and the sense of separation. The promise is appealing: weaken the ego and peace will naturally arise. Yet this narrative oversimplifies something that plays a vital psychological role. Treating the ego solely as an obstacle ignores its fundamental function, the organization of consciousness. At its most basic level, the ego is the reference point of identity. It allows a person to say, I feel, I think, I choose. Without this minimal structure, experience becomes diffuse and unstable. When spirituality promotes ego-dissolution without adequate preparation, it can generate confusion rather than clarity. The unconscious is already vast and complex, and without a stable mediator, it can overwhelm consciousness, producing feelings of loss of control and deep insecurity. In practical terms, this appears in subtle ways. People who claim to have transcended the ego, yet cannot establish boundaries. People who speak of detachment, yet feel constantly invaded or diminished. The attempt to kill the ego ends up weakening the ability to stand firmly in the world. The shadow does not disappear, it simply takes command, hidden behind spiritual language. This does not mean the ego should be inflated or glorified. The danger exists at both extremes. A rigid ego imprisons, but the absence of ego fragments. The wiser path lies in integration, recognizing the ego as a tool rather than an ultimate identity. This requires patience and a willingness to confront contradictions without fleeing into idealization. When the ego is understood in this way, something fundamental shifts. Spirituality ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a space for genuine maturation. The individual learns to sustain their own experience without hiding behind elevated concepts. And this marks a turning point, because it opens space for a far more uncomfortable question. What happens when what we have been avoiding, the shadow, begins to demand direct recognition? One of the quietest and most common mistakes at the intersection of psychology and spirituality is the confusion of experiential levels. When people speak of self, ego, or identity, They often assume these terms refer to the same thing. They do not. There is the self as a psychological structure, responsible for organizing life, choices, and continuity of experience. And there is the experience of no self, described in deep contemplative states. Confusing these levels produces disorientation, not liberation. The psychological self is not a metaphysical belief, it is a functional necessity. It supports responsibility, decision-making, relationships, and coherence in everyday life. When spiritual practices are used to attack this functional structure, the result is rarely clarity, it is destabilization. A person may experience moments of expanded awareness, yet lose the capacity to integrate those experiences into real life. The error lies not in the experience itself, but in its misplaced application. No self, in the spiritual sense, points to something entirely different. It does not describe the functional disappearance of identity, but the direct realization that identity is not fixed, absolute, or independent. It is a contemplative insight, not a psychological operating system. When someone attempts to turn this insight into a permanent rule for daily living, they demand from the self something it was never designed to carry. The result is often exhaustion, confusion, and a persistent inner conflict. In practice, this error becomes visible when someone tries to live as if they were always in a meditative state. Simple decisions feel overwhelming, relationships become unclear, and the sense of direction weakens. The person believes they are transcending the ego, while in reality, they are undermining their capacity to act in the world. The psychological self, attacked prematurely, does not vanish. It fragments, and fragmentation has never been synonymous with awakening. Recognizing this distinction transforms the entire inner journey. Instead of fighting the self, the individual learns to situate it correctly. There are moments for silence and dissolution, and moments for structure and action. When each has its proper place, the path ceases to feel chaotic and begins to make sense. This clarity prepares the ground for an even more sensitive issue. What happens when someone seeks awakening while ignoring their own story, their personal biography? One of the deepest misunderstandings of contemporary spiritual pursuit is the attempt to awaken without engaging one's own history. Many believe consciousness expands despite biography, when in truth it deepens through it. A lived life, with choices, mistakes, relationships, and disappointments, is not an obstacle to inner development. It is the very ground upon which it unfolds. Ignoring this dimension creates a spirituality that is abstract and disconnected from lived reality. Biography carries marks that cannot be dissolved by elevated ideas alone. Unintegrated trauma, repressed desires, avoided decisions, and unresolved pain continue to operate in the unconscious, regardless of how many hours one meditates. When these layers are ignored, the promised awakening turns into emptiness. Not a fertile emptiness, but a hollowing out, a state in which the person no longer knows who they are or why they do what they do. In daily life, this often manifests as a strange sense of dislocation. The individual speaks of presence and awareness, yet struggles to sustain commitments, assume responsibility, or build long-term projects. There is a quiet rejection of personal history, as if everything that came before must be erased for something new to appear. But consciousness cannot exist without continuity. What is not integrated returns as confusion, numbness, or chronic inner conflict. Integrating biography does not mean clinging to the past. It means recognizing it as part of the process. It means looking at one's own trajectory honestly, without attempting to spiritualize wounds that still require care. This can take very practical forms, revisiting pivotal decisions, noticing recurring relational patterns, acknowledging emotions long avoided. This work is not fast, but it creates a real foundation for any authentic expansion of awareness. When biography is integrated, awakening ceases to be an escape and becomes a gradual maturation. One does not need to deny who they were in order to understand who they are. In fact, the more personal history is welcomed, the more space opens for a less illusory relationship with the self. This insight leads to an essential question. If the problem is not the spiritual tradition itself, why do so many collapses appear precisely outside the original context of Buddhism? There is a point at which psychology and spirituality inevitably converge. What is not acknowledged begins to quietly govern life. In psychology, this is called the shadow. In Buddhism, it often appears as ignorance. Different terms, same dynamic. What remains outside awareness does not disappear. It acts indirectly, shaping choices, reactions, and even core beliefs. This is how suffering persists even in those who consider themselves awakened. The shadow is not merely a collection of negative traits. It includes repressed desires, unclaimed talents, undigested emotions, and truths that threaten the identity one has constructed. When spirituality is used as escape, these aspects are quickly dismissed as egoic illusions. But the unconscious does not accept indefinite neglect. It finds openings: sarcasm, harsh judgments, unexplained irritability. The conflict does not vanish. It changes form. In everyday situations, this becomes evident. Someone preaches compassion, yet reacts aggressively toward those who think differently. Another speaks of detachment, yet feels envy when others succeed. These reactions do not indicate spiritual failure. They indicate lack of integration. The shadow demands attention, not condemnation. A simple practice is to observe exaggerated reactions. Whenever something provokes a response that feels disproportionate, it is worth asking what it reveals internally. Ignoring the shadow is often more comfortable than facing it. Admitting fear, anger, or vulnerability contradicts the image of spiritual advancement many strive to maintain. This is where self-deception takes root, nourished by elevated language and practices that avoid direct contact within a truth. This illusion can persist for years, but it extracts its cost through chronic tension and a pervasive sense of emptiness. The promised peace never settles because essential parts of human experience were excluded. When shadow and ignorance are recognized as allies of the process, something reorganizes within. Instead of fighting what arises, the individual learns to listen. The path stops being moralistic and becomes honest. This shift prepares the decisive turn, recognizing when spirituality ceases to function as a path of clarity and begins to operate as a psychological shield, which is precisely what must be examined next. At a certain point, spirituality can stop serving as a tool for clarity and begin functioning as a comfortable refuge from pain. Most of the time, this happens unconsciously. The individual believes they are progressing, while in reality they are constructing a more sophisticated narrative to avoid suffering. Elevated concepts replace direct contact with experience, and consciousness becomes beautiful language without genuine transformation. This is where spirituality becomes escape. This often occurs when difficult emotions arise with intensity. Instead of investigating the root of pain, the person reaches for ready-made explanations. This is just the ego. It's an illusion. It will pass if I meditate more. These statements can hold truth, but removed from context, they reinforce self-deception. The unconscious quickly recognizes when it is being silenced and responds with tension, numbness, or persistent inner conflict. Peace does not arrive because dialogue with the inner world was prematurely shut down. In real life, the signs are recognizable. Highly spiritual individuals who avoid difficult conversations, evade relational conflict, or cannot tolerate ordinary frustration. Others spend years moving from one practice to another, from retreat to retreat, endlessly chasing the next experience of expansion. The issue is not the practice itself, but how it is used. When spirituality serves to avoid the shadow, it ceases to integrate and begins to fragment. A clear indicator of this escape is rigidity disguised as serenity. Everything must be peaceful, everything must be accepted immediately, leaving no space for ambivalence. Any intense emotion is treated as failure. This creates an illusion of stability that depends on constant emotional control. A single significant crisis can cause the entire structure to collapse, revealing that the foundation was never solid. What was missing was an honest relationship with identity. Recognizing this is not regression, it is maturity. When spirituality ceases to be a shield and becomes a tool once again, something opens. The individual begins to see that clarity does not arise from denial, but from integrating what was previously avoided. This recognition prepares the next step, understanding where Jung and Buddhism ultimately converge, not in escape, but in the conscious integration of human experience. When Buddhism is observed within its traditional context, an important fact becomes evident. Many of the psychological collapses associated with modern spirituality do not occur in the same way. This is not because Buddhism works better, but because it was never conceived as an isolated technique for alleviating individual distress. It existed within a broader structure that included ethics, discipline, community, and continuous guidance. Outside this structure, practice loses much of its regulatory function. In traditional Buddhism, the path does not begin with dissolving the self, but with organizing life. Before engaging in deeper practices, there are clear commitments to conduct, attention, and responsibility. This establishes a minimal psychological foundation capable of containing intense experiences. When these layers are removed, only technique remains, and technique alone cannot sustain deep inner transformation. Another crucial element is the presence of a teacher and a community. The practitioner does not walk alone, nor interpret everything through personal projection. There is correction, reflection, and containment. In Western contexts, spiritual practice often becomes solitary, mediated by books, videos, or isolated experiences. Without an external mirror, self-deception finds fertile ground, disguised as insight or awakening. Traditional Buddhism also never demanded the denial of ordinary human experience. Emotions, conflicts, and limitations were not treated as spiritual failures, but as integral parts of the path. The problem arises when fragments of the tradition are extracted and used as shortcuts to escape discomfort. What was once gradual becomes an immediate demand for transcendence, something the psychological self cannot yet sustain. Understanding this reframes the entire issue. It is not a conflict between Jung and Buddhism, but a distinction between tradition and superficial adaptation. The collapse does not arise from the teaching itself, but from the absence of structure surrounding it. This distinction sets the stage for the final deep inquiry. If integration is the true common axis, what does maturity require before any attempt at dissolution? A closer look reveals that the deepest point of convergence between Jung and Buddhism is not the promise of escaping the world, but the principle of integration. Both recognize that suffering arises from a distorted relationship with experience, not from experience itself. The aim is not to eliminate parts of the psyche or of life, but to expand awareness so it can include what was previously rejected. This demands presence, patience, and above all, honesty with oneself. From a psychological perspective, integration means allowing the ego to perform its function without becoming tyrannical. It organizes identity, establishes boundaries, and gives shape to conscious experience. At the same time, it must acknowledge that it does not govern everything. The unconscious carries contents that require space and listening, not repression. When these dimensions can dialogue, inner conflict begins to lose its grip, not because it was denied, but because it was understood. Practically speaking, this can be applied in simple ways. Instead of attempting to transcend a difficult emotion, one can observe it with curiosity. If anger arises, ask what it is protecting or signaling. If fear appears, ask where it comes from and what it is trying to preserve. This posture aligns both with depth psychology and genuine meditation. It is not control, but lucid attention, without escape, without dramatization. This understanding also dismantles a common illusion, that integration is comfortable. It is not. It requires walking through ambiguity, acknowledging contradictions, and abandoning self-deception. The difference is that once this work is undertaken, spirituality stops being performance and becomes a real path. The shadow loses its power to sabotage because it is no longer ignored. What once ruled silently becomes visible within awareness. When Jung and Buddhism meet at this level, awakening ceases to be a distant ideal and becomes a living practice. There is no promise of perfection, only a sustained commitment to the truth of lived experience. This realization completes the cycle that began with fascination, while opening something even deeper, the possibility of living with less illusion and more presence. Examined carefully, the deepest convergence between Jung and Buddhism is not the destruction of the self, but the requirement of maturity before any attempt at transcendence. Both recognize that consciousness cannot be sustained in emptiness. It requires a stable foundation to avoid confusion and spiritual idealization. Dissolution without preparation does not liberate, it destabilizes. Maturity here does not mean rigidity or clinging to identity. It means the capacity to hold one's own experience without fleeing from it. A mature self can tolerate ambivalence, frustration, and limitation without collapse. When this foundation exists, expanded states can be integrated into everyday life. Without it, even profound experiences become difficult to translate into concrete decisions and real relationships. Psychologically, this maturity appears as the ability to take responsibility for one's life, to choose, to fail, to repair, to sustain bonds, to move through conflict. Spiritually, it means refusing to use practice as anesthesia and instead using it to expand lucidity. Here, Jung and Buddhism align more closely than most realize. Neither offers shortcuts that bypass this foundational work. In practice, this maturity can be recognized in those who have genuinely developed along the inner path. They do not present themselves as enlightened, nor do they feel the need to constantly demonstrate detachment. If anything, they become simpler, more present, less reactive, not because the self was erased, but because the struggle against it has ceased. Quiet integration replaces the constant effort to transcend. This brings the entire arc into focus. Before dissolving anything, one must ask whether it was ever truly built. Before letting go of the self, it is necessary to know whether it is strong enough to be released without fragmenting. This understanding does not end the journey, it deepens it. From this point, everything explored throughout the narrative aligns around a single axis, ready to be carried into the closing reflection. Along this path, it becomes clear that the real challenge is not choosing between psychology and spirituality, between Jung and Buddhism. The central issue is recognizing how the desire to destroy the self often emerges from deep exhaustion. The exhaustion of feeling, enduring, and carrying one's own experience. When spirituality becomes an attempt to erase inner conflict, it stops liberating and begins to confuse. Integration begins when one accepts that a self is still needed in order to move through life with clarity. Perhaps the most honest question is not, how do I get rid of the ego, but what kind of self am I building to hold my awareness? A fragile self seeks shortcuts. An integrated self can observe suffering without fleeing from it. This changes everything. How difficult emotions are handled, how relationships unfold, how frustration is met, and even how spirituality itself is approached. It is not about clinging to identity, but about maturing it before questioning it. This reflection can be brought directly into daily life. Notice where the rush toward transcendence appears, where discomfort is rejected, where the word spirituality is being used as protection against inconvenient truths. Small actions matter. Listening to an emotion before labeling it, holding silence without rushing to fill it, recognizing limits without guilt. This work is less glamorous, but infinitely more transformative. In the end, Jung and Buddhism may be pointing in the same direction through different paths, not toward the destruction of the self, but toward a more conscious relationship with it, not toward escaping human experience, but toward inhabiting it with less illusion and more presence. And the final question remains simple and uncomfortable. Is the self you are trying to destroy truly the problem, or is it still exactly what you need to integrate? If this reflection was meaningful to you, like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way you can continue exploring psychology, spirituality, and self-understanding without relying on easy shortcuts.